Welcome to Reading the Gospels Together, and today we are in John chapter 12. Now, when last we left Jesus, he and the disciples had headed for the hills out of the public eye. But now Passover is approaching. It's just 6 days away, and the team travels to Bethany, just over the Mount of Olives from Jerusalem, and to the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. A dinner is given in Jesus' honor in celebration of the raising of Lazarus, who's eating together with them. Now, I don't know if you remember way back in Luke chapter 10 when Martha and Mary receive a visit from Jesus. And Martha complains to Jesus that she's doing all the work while her sister Mary sits at the feet of Jesus, hanging on his every word. Now, lots has happened since then, but some things never change. Once again, we read, Martha is serving the meal, Mary's at the feet of Jesus. But this time something different is going on. We read, Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Now, this is an extravagant gesture indeed. A pint of nard, which was in those days imported all the way from northern India, would be worth a laborer's yearly wage. Now, I remember in the days of my romantic youth, and yes, I had a romantic youth, I remember purchasing a tiny bottle of Oscar de la Renta perfume for Dana. A little tiny thing. It must have represented a week's part-time salary for me then. I suppose a pint of it would have been beyond all ability for me to buy. Besides which, most perfumes you buy by the pint aren't really worth wearing. In any case, Mary has this jar of nard. The other Gospels call it an alabaster jar, reflecting the value of its contents. And not only does she pour it on Jesus' feet, she then wipes his feet with her hair. Now, that's an act of considerable devotion and intimacy. I'm sure the discomfort level among everyone at the dinner skyrocketed, particularly since to this day, Jewish women, particularly Orthodox married women, would never uncover their hair in public, but Mary does, and washes Jesus' feet with her hair, with the perfume. Well, now, pushed over the edge by this scene, it is Judas who breaks the silence. Why wasn't this perfume sold and money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages, he says. Now, John adds the disclaimer that Judas didn't say this out of any concern for the poor, but rather because he, as keeper of the money bag, was accustomed to skimming off the top, and 300 denarii would have been a very tasty score indeed. Jesus' response is often misconstrued. He says, "You'll always have the poor among you, but you'll not always have me," which can come across as rather callous. Well, this won't solve the problem of the poor, is another way to read it. But before you get upset, take a moment to realize that Jesus, as he often does, is quoting the Old Testament, namely Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 11, where we read, "There will always be poor people in the land." Now, importantly, the verse goes on to say, "Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land." Now, the saying of Jesus then does not mean to give up helping the poor, but instead to realize that despite the fact that it's a task that shall never be finished, you should never reach the stage where you think, I've given enough. Why? Because there's still always poor people who are in need. But remember, Jesus always says, you will not always have me. He had said it was meant that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. Now, Jewish sources from ancient times indicate that care of the dead was to take precedence over almsgiving. That is to say, a family's responsibility to see their dead properly buried is a financial priority. And while Jesus is not yet dead, the perfume was intended, he says, for his burial. It was set aside for that purpose, but Mary, for reasons of her own, is choosing to use it now. Maybe she really did know what was coming. Maybe she believed it when Jesus said it, because so far the disciples do not. Well, before we leave this scene, there's something I'd like you to notice. In chapter 11, you might recall that Mary, in her grief, did not go out to meet Jesus when he came to Lazarus' tomb. She left that task to Martha. when Mary finally did go out, we read, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. That time, she was at the feet of Jesus in grief and accusation, staining his feet with her angry tears. Now, she is at his feet in worship, anointing his feet with perfume. Well, there's one more facet to this dinner party. Listen. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there, and they came not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. Fair enough. I'd line up to see Jesus, and I would certainly be curious to see the once dead Lazarus as well. But there's an ominous outcome to this curiosity. Here's what comes next. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. Wow, that's harsh. It shows you just how desperate the temple authorities are getting. They're planning to not only kill Jesus, but also to cover up any evidence of his miracles as well, including getting rid of this Lazarus guy. So, was Lazarus killed? Well, there are two strands of later church tradition, because it doesn't talk about it again in the Bible. One of those strands of church tradition places him in Cyprus after fleeing Judea to escape the threat against his life. Another, far less likely and far later tradition has Mary, Martha, and Lazarus fleeing by boat to France, where Lazarus becomes, of all things, Bishop of Marseille. Now, while I favor the Cyprus story, it seems far more likely, and where his bones are said to reside, historical evidences for either one of these are pretty thin. We're just going to have to leave that and speculate on our own. Well, the story soon switches from this Lazarus event to the triumphal entry, which we've covered in our other gospel videos. We're not quite finished with Lazarus yet. We'll be back to him in a moment. What surprises us here is that the whole Jesus on a donkey, crowds shouting Hosanna thing that we read about is not understood by the disciples at the time. They don't know what's going on. Not until after the resurrection. As John puts it, at first his disciples did not understand all of this. Only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him and that these things had been done to him. Now, John's referring to the Old Testament verses shouted by the crowd and the symbolism of Jesus riding a donkey into the city. After the resurrection, the whole story of Jesus being complete, the disciples began to read the whole Testament in a different way, seeing again and again in retrospect how Psalms and prophets pointed again and again to Jesus. Just like those guys on the road to Emmaus after the resurrection. They don't know Jesus has been raised. They're fleeing the city to Emmaus. Jesus, somehow in disguise, meets them on the road and explains to them from the Old Testament everything that had happened to himself. This is what the disciples figured out as well after the resurrection. It takes the disciples a while, just like it takes us a while, to understand everything about Jesus. I've been studying the Bible for over 40 years, and I'm still figuring things out for the first time. Such as, where did the crowds who cheered and sang and waved palm branches come from? Well, John tells us right here. He writes, now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. That same crowd who gathered in Bethany to catch sight of Jesus and Lazarus, they've come over the top of the Mount of Olives with them, and with them they're heading down the hill into Jerusalem. And further, John says, many people, because they had heard that he performed this sign, went out to meet them. Now, I must have read this verse countless times, but I confess it's the first time I noticed it, proving once again there's a difference between reading the Bible and actually noticing what it says. The crowd cheering Jesus' entry have been gathered together by the witnesses to the raising of Lazarus. The crowd is greeting the worker of miracles. Could this be the Messiah? It's an expectant and an enthusiastic group, not just a random group, but a group gathered for the purpose. That's a much different mood from the crowd which later that same week will call for his crucifixion. In fact, it's a much different crowd altogether. Well, we end with the peek at the frustrated Pharisees. This verse I have noticed before, who complain, "This is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him." They have long since lost whatever control they hoped to exert over the events of that Passover week. Now, next time, we'll see how the crowd handles the arrival of Jesus, and as we did at the baptism and the transfiguration, we will hear one more time the very voice of God. We'll see you then for John chapter 12, part 2. Make sure to read it in preparation, and when you read, make sure to notice what's there. See you then.